Hello friends, welcome back to the class. I am Dr. Sonali Maurya, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Chhatrapati Sahooji Maharaj University, Kanpur. In today's lecture, I'll be talking about process of communication, its meaning, its definition, its importance, and types of communication, especially verbal communication and its subtypes, written communication and verbal communication, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of written communication as well as oral communication. So for example, this is the table of content. Here you can see that what is communication. I'm talking about that, what is the definition and meaning, importance, and of course the objectives of communication, communication cycle, and what are the different elements of communication, and what is verbal communication, and what are the subtypes of verbal communication, for example, oral communication, written communication, and how we can make a communication effective, right? So here I'll be starting with the definition of communication, that what is communication? Communication is a process. It is a process of transmitting and receiving verbal and non-verbal messages. It is considered effective when it achieves the desired reaction or response from the receiver. It is also considered that it is a one-way, it is a two-way exchange, because communication is always, because in communication process, communication cannot take place without the sender and receiver. All right, so that's why it is also considered that it is a two-way process or two-way exchange process. So communication is a two-way process of exchange ideas or information between sender and receiver. And communication is also considered that it is a behavior modifier, right? So because why it is considered that it is a behavior modifier? Because it is the means by which behavior is modified, change is effected, and information is made and made productive, and goals are achieved, right? And for in any business, like organizations, or in any business setup, the exchange of messages between organizational people for bringing out or bringing about desirable and target-oriented results, it is very important to establish a kind of an effective communication. All right. So here, here I'll be talking about that what is the importance and what are the common objectives of communication. So first objective, or first objective of communication is to establish goals, establish and disseminate the goals of enterprise or of goals of an enterprise, and also develop plans. In any business organization, develop plans for achievement of organizational objective. Communication is very important. And also organize resources, organize human and other resources in most effective and efficient way. And also select and develop and appraise members of organization. Without the communication process, to select, develop, and appraise members of organization is not possible. And of course, lead, direct, and motivate, and also create a climate for contribution for the future. So communication, without the communication, control performance towards organization goal is also not possible. So it has tremendous importance and relevance in any business setup or in our day-to-day communication as well. This is the communication cycle. So here you can see that communication cycle operates within a particular context involving sender, encoding, medium, message, decoding, receiver, and feedback. These are also the elements of communication. So here sender who is considered the initiator of communication, because it feels, because it is only the sender who feels the need to express ideas or information. And also, this person, sender, also choose appropriate medium to convey, the ideas or information or anything to the receiver. And the second process or the second element of any communication process is encoding. What is encoding? Encoding is translating thoughts into words or into language, using symbols or gestures, using a shared medium. Why it is said that it is a shared medium? Because we are using both the verbal and non-verbal mediums together. And then comes the medium, because without the medium, communication process can't take place. All right. So here the channel, the verbal and non-verbal through which the message travel. So for example, phone or letter or email. So this can be considered as a medium in any communication process. Then comes about the decoding of the message. Here the receiver who actually receives the message from the sender tries to comprehend that message, the message which is sent by the sender. But it depends on shared language and also the minimized noise which may take place in between the process of communication, right? So what is, this is just opposite to the decoding process. Decoding is to comprehend or to understand or take in the message which is sent by the sender. Then there's a receiver, because without the receiver, communication remains incomplete, right? The receiver receives and interprets the message, and here the receiver's role becomes very, very important in order to understand or comprehend the message, because he should be very, very attentive to both verbal and non-verbal cues in order to infer, in order to make the meaning out of that message which is sent by the sender. And then comes feedback, because without the feedback, your communication process remains incomplete. All right. So here the feedback, here only through the feedback, sender comes to know that whatever intention or whatever your message intend to, now whether whatever intention you had earlier when you encoded the message, it got fulfilled or not. So that's why the response sent back to the sender, that is which is very, very important in order to completing the communication cycle. All right. So here now we can see in detail that what is the role of sender, because sender is also considered the initiator of communication process, because here the sender is the person who feels the need to communicate and express certain ideas for ideas or thoughts to the other person. And he is also prompted by external or internal stimuli to communicate. And because sender also must choose an appropriate medium in order to, medium which is accessible to both sender as well as receiver. And sender has the responsibility of appropriate encoding and also keeping context in mind before encoding the message and transmitting it. And here sender also has very important role, because he must ensure message conveys the proper meaning or the desired feedback that can be elicited by the receiver. And then comes encoding process, because encoding is translating thoughts into communication messages, because here whatever we have the abstract ideas in our mind. So it may be any idea or any thought or any concept, right? So in this process, we actually give a proper structure to our ideas, to our thoughts, to our to any concept which is abstract. So we make it the tangible, a very, very structured form. So here sender's communication skill and an estimate of the receiver's comprehension ability. That may be guided by the encoding. And in encoding process, it involves both verbal and non-verbal, because encoding use shared code of verbal and non-verbal things. So you may use verbal language as well as gestures, signs and symbols in order to make your communication very, very effective. So in encoding process, it involves both the thing verbal and non-verbal, because here at this level, there's a quality test also. The quality test of whether that communication process is an effective or not. So the quality test in terms of effectiveness of encoding. Encoding is ultimately tested by receiver's comprehension. If your message which is transferred to the receiver is not like, is not getting comprehend or is not like, here the receiver is not able to take in, then like, that being the sender or being like, being the encoder of that message, you are like, fail at that like, level. Right? So here the very, the purpose which gives substance to abstract ideas and provides logical codes to unformulated thoughts. So the very purpose of encoding is to give a proper structure or very well shape, to well shape, those thoughts or the abstract ideas into abstract one, or into concrete form in order to like, in order to transmit it or in order to communicate with your receiver. Then comes the medium or message. Message, like, this is a kind of like, channel of communication. Here message can be treated as like, it flows like a water, or medium is a kind of container, and then, the channel which works as a pipe, right? So here the system of codes, the medium is a system of codes and signs with a somewhat, determinable meaning shared between sender and receiver. Because it also enables decoding, that in the encoding prepares the message in a medium that enables the receiver to decode and understand the original idea or the intended meaning which is communicated by the sender. Then it is also essential for transfer, because message transfer necessarily depends on some medium. Without the medium you cannot, or you will be unable to transmit or communicate that message, right? So without it, the message can neither be, encoded or sent to the receiver. So in this case, like, the channel is very important, that which particular channel that you are like, you're using in communication process. Your channel can be like, the phone or the letter, email, computer. So this is also the conduit that carries the message from one point to another. And then there's another element, that is the decoding. Of course, decoding is like, the comprehending the meaning of the message, which is conveyed by the sender. Because it is also the medium skills of like, it also depends on the medium skills of receiver, that how the receiver decodes or how the receiver comprehends or taken that particular message which is conveyed by the sender. So once message reads, receiver, it serves communicative purpose only if understood. So if like, that communication or that message which is sent by the receiver, it is not understood by the receiver, then it doesn't serve the very purpose of communication. Because, so here the interferences, for example, like, the physical noise, it sometimes also reduce quality of incoming message or may lead to faulty decoding as well, right? So here misinterpretation often occur due to inadequate knowledge of the shared code. For example, if the receiver is not having the knowledge of that particular symbol or the sign or the language in which the message is encoded by the sender, then it also becomes very difficult to take in or to understand or comprehend that message which was sent by the receiver. So there's a quality. There's always a possibility of transmission loses when a message travels between parties. So of course, when it like, travels between multiple parties, then there's a like, possibility is there to like, your message get distorted, or sometimes it may also lose the intended meaning, right? So here decoding process also depends on the quality of senders encoding, right? And also the ability of senders encoding the message, right? Then comes receiver. Receiver is another element of communication process, because here the end point of communication. Receiver can also be considered as the end point of communication as well as the beginning of feedback. Because the feedback is the last element of cycle of communication, all right? So here being the receptive, receiver being the receptive must be alert and very, very attentive to multiple signals, especially the non-verbal cues accompanying verbal messages. And there should be a shared medium as well. As I said, that here the sender and receiver, they both should share the common codes. Otherwise it becomes very difficult if the sender and receiver, there's a difference between the codes. Then the meaning, the intended meaning, or the symbols in which the message is encoded, will not, here at this point receiver will not be able to understand that intended meaning. All right. And then active listening from from receiver's part, it is very important to stay very attentive in terms of listening, because in oral communication, here the listener must listen with care, since sound signals exist only momentarily. So because you cannot record those moments for for your future reference, so here the receiver must be very careful. And in order to avoid ambiguity, avoiding ambiguity also helps ensure the messages are decoded properly and intended meaning is understood by the receiver. So here a receiver has a very essential role, because a receiver's cooperation in the communication process is very essential. Without it, the exchange itself is at stake. And the mixed media. Here a mixed media, for example, the body language, oral communication helps eliminate misunderstanding between the sender and the receiver. And then of course the feedback which is considered the completion of communication cycle, because this is the last element. And here there's you will come to know that at this point how the receiver, when the receiver decodes the message and also starts off start thinking of giving the feedback to the sender, here the receiver becomes sender and the sender becomes receiver. So here there is a reversal role that you will see. Here the original sender becomes the receiver and the original receiver becomes the sender at this point. So here the receiver becomes the new sender, that you can say, and the original sender becomes the new receiver. So here role reverses in feedback, and the very purpose of the feedback is to it allows the sender to access to assess whether the message was understood and whether it had the desired impact on. So because it is one-way exception, because in memos or news news settlers and of course announcements, feedback is sometimes absent, feedback is absent, and it also increases the risk of misunderstanding. So in when the process is one way, right, then of course for example in cases of in memos or news letters, in these cases here the communication remains one-way process. So there is no feedback, very immediate, there is no immediate feedback. So of course it also, sometimes because feedback remains absent, so it may be under it might be the risks are higher of misunderstanding. Even silence also counts as feedback, because it conveys a certain meaning or certain message in itself. And for example, at any workplace, without feedback, managers may struggle to assess the effectiveness of their communications. All right. So here you will you have seen that how the communication process actually works and how it actually it remains in cycle, and how the sender becomes the receiver and the receivers become the sender when he gives the feedback to the sender, right? So it is a kind of cycle process which remains which always remains in process. Now I'll be talking about the different types of communication. So first I'm going to talk about the verbal communication. So what is verbal communication and what are the types of verbal communication? So verbal communication is the exchange of information, thoughts and feelings through the use of of a spoken and then written words. And it is also considered the structured process. It involves a sender as well as receiver and encompasses face-to-face conversations, phone calls, meetings and written messages. And verbal communication takes place especially for the complex, when you want to convey very complex ideas or concepts. So that is actually not possible using the non-verbal cues. I mean, non-verbal cues is something that you without effort or unknowingly that you use. But in order when you completely or entirely depend on non-verbal cues, then it's very difficult to convey the complex ideas. So this verbal communication really helps in transmitting the complex ideas, and in order to transmitting complex ideas, it is essential for expressing. It is essential for expressing complex ideas, building relationships, and also providing clarity. So here we basically use, a proper linguistic system in verbal communication. It uses a structured language that with established rules of grammar, and also the syntax, the most advanced communication system. This also considered one of the most advanced, because this is something which is very universal process, because you cannot deviate from the grammar or the syntactic rules. So here you will have to follow a very structured form which is universal for all. And this is the process which also makes the human beings distinct from the animals. So here the verbal communication is the foremost faculty that distinguishes mankind from the set of the animal world. And then, as I said, that I'll be talking about the types of verbal communication. So there are the two types of verbal communication: oral communication and written communication. So what is oral communication? Oral communication is the exchange of information, ideas or feelings through spoken words, especially, for example, conversations, speeches, meetings, and typically, and oral communication is typically faster and very interactive in nature. However, written communication conveys messages through written symbols, emails, reports, letters, and written communication is also considered which is something permanent. Right, you can also use it, for your future references as well. And this is very precise, and it also has legal validity. All right. And now let's begin with the oral communication. That what are the advantages of oral communication? Oral communication is, let's first talk about the advantages of it. It's something which is very spontaneous, because generally here the sender doesn't have much time to to think about it, or to ponder, or to formulate ideas, right? So it is something which is spontaneous. We don't generally take we don't generally take much time, right? So it is something which is very spontaneous, which is generally coming out from within. And it also has a greater speed in comparison of the written communication, where we can take more time to think and formulate our ideas, and then we can write it down, or we can send it to our receiver. And this is also it also has this quality of instantaneous reception also. And in this process of oral communication, we also get immediate feedback, because because this generally takes place in in face-to-face in communication, where the two people are are present. So in this case here, the feedback, the immediate feedback is possible, and if there is any confusion, the clarity can be accessed very soon. Asking to the sender for much elaboration, or to explain it further if there is any confusion at any point. That is not possible in written communication. And this oral communication is something which is very persuasive as well. And for example, when you are speaking and you think that you have spoken something wrong, or you want to make the correction, so here the midway correction is also possible in oral communication. That is not possible in written communication. When you have sent, or once you have transmitted the message, then the correction is not possible, right? And the oral communication also helps us in in establishing the social bond between between among the people, or between the sender and receiver, of course. But this process is also considered very informal, because for the formal things, generally we avoid oral communication, because it generally doesn't have any validity, because once you say something, then we there's no record, there's no validation in the future. So that's why this oral communication is also considered that this is something which is informal process. So it also has some disadvantages as well. For example, the first one is it cannot be documented for future use, because since you have spoken and there's no documentation or no record of it, so it cannot be used for for your future documentation. And it also has limited time for formulation of ideas. For example, what you can do in written communication, you can take time, you can think on it, and then you can formulate a particular you can come up with certain very well structured message. That is not possible, because here you have limitation of times in order to to formulate your ideas, to give a proper structure to it, right? Because it also involves hurried planning, because when you are in face-to-face communication, you are generally you are supposed to speak when to give feedback or response, or to give a proper reaction, or or answer to the person who is just in front of you. So it's also it also involves hurried planning. So sometimes you also feel regret that what you have said earlier, and you also feel that you must you could have you could have done something, or you could have said something better, or communicated in a better or proper manner that you fail to. So sometimes it also it's a negative point, because you always, because this is something which is which involves hurried planning. And it also depends on listening and activeness, because here your listening ability, you should be a very, very active listener. And because everything depends on your activeness as well as your listening listening ability. If you're not a good listener, then you can't be a good speaker as well, and you won't be able to speak properly, or you won't be able to formulate the right answer or the right response or the feedback for the receiver. So as I said that sometimes you may feel that that you have said something which is wrong, or you should have not said that. And sometimes it it is it is a wastage of time as well, because there's no concrete result. And so this is also one of the disadvantages of oral communication. And this entire process of oral communication also depends on the memorization process, or on your memory, or your presence of mind, right? So and sometimes you are not always in a good mood, right? To answer something, or to give a proper response or feedback to someone. But so sometimes it also creates a very negative image or perception for you. And responsibility can't be fixed. Just using the oral communication, you can't fix responsibility. You cannot here any person can't be accountable or responsible for anything, right? And of course there's no legal validity in oral communication, right? For any legal issue, any property ownership or something like that, you can't use oral communication. For that you'll have to go, or you'll have to be dependent on written communication only. So let's talk about first I'll be talking about that what are the the key principles for impactful oral communication, right? How we can speak effectively. So there should be clarity, conciseness, and completeness in your messages. Whatever message, whatever idea that it should be, or it must be clear in meaning. Or it should be very, very brief in expression and complete in content. And one should also use good vocabulary. Which should be rich. A sender should use a very. A sender should have or must have rich word choice, which improves precision, and also it should be very, very impactful. It should also being the oral communicator, one should the speaker, one should also avoid the jargons unless the audience audience understand it. So until or unless the person or your target audience can understand it, then only you should use certain jargons. I mean, when it is unavoidable. So there are certain situations where you will have to. So then only you should use. Otherwise, you have to avoid it. So you should also know before you speak something. You should also know your target. Who are your target audience? Whether they understand that that language or that symbol or whatever message you are going to to convey to them. So they should. I mean, you should have proper knowledge, or you should always keep in mind that who are your target audience. So being the oral, being the speaker, effective communicator, if you really want to speak effectively, then there should be proper or appropriate use of paralanguage as well. Paralanguage is there should be a proper tone, pitch, also pace, and there should be proper pauses as well when you are conveying the message, because beyond the words, because you are not just using the words, but there should be these things should be, and then use them deliberately. They should not be that you are not using deliberately. For example, when you are using just a single tone, it also becomes monotonous, and you are not using the pauses, or there's a pitch is very high or pitch is very low, or you are not, I mean, there's a pace is very, I mean, there's a very higher pace. So it actually becomes very difficult for the receiver to understand it. And congruity of media, of course. I mean, the verbal message should align with the non-verbal cues, of course, because when you are speaking and you are not using the body language and I mean, especially the facial expressions and your body posture, and then your certain gestures and facial expressions, eye movements. I mean, one should use alongside all these things. I mean, there should be the mingling of both verbal and non-verbal in oral communication that actually makes it very effective. And then the expression of commitment, and of course the speaker's sincerity and enthusiasm. It reinforces credibility and also trust with the audience. Then the last one is the good listener. I mean, the good listening is also a good listener. If you are a good listener, then you also be a good, effective and a good speaker as well. So for becoming a good or effective speaker, effective speakers are also effective listeners, because if you're not a good listener, then you cannot become a good speaker as well. So they adopt, they also adapt, based on audience reactions and feedback, because if you don't know that what are the audience feedback and there is reactions, then it also for you it also becomes very difficult to communicate. All right. Now coming to this topic, the written communication, that is a subtype of verbal communication. Written communication is just opposite to oral communication, as we have when we were discussing about the advantages and disadvantages of oral communication. I told you certain thing. So here, first of all, I need to talk about that what is written communication. And written communication is the act of writing, typing, or printing symbols, to convey information, providing a record for future references as well. So now we'll be talking about that what are the certain advantages and disadvantages of written communication. In written communication is something which is very creative process. In written communication, because you have enough time to think, you can formulate your ideas in a much more creative manner. So that's why this process is also known as that it is a very creative process. It also aids memory, because I mean, there is nothing that you cannot read it again. So it also aids to memory, because you can read it, or you can go through the content or the material for multiple times. So it also aids to memory, because listening any message just for for one time, or reading the same thing multiple times, it of course aids memory, or it enhances the memorization process. Then this written process also has this also has this advantage of greater credibility and accuracy, because since you had enough time to formulate your ideas, so you are supposed to write. I mean, because whatever you are conveying, you will be you will be responsible for that. So I mean, it is generally considered that whatever in written things there is a credibility, because when something is in written, then you can't you can't deny it, right? So I mean, there should be, and there is, I mean, in comparison of the oral communication, because oral communication is considered very, very informal in nature, but that is not the case with written communication, because written communication should be very, very accurate, right? So and then it can also be referred to at a future date also, because for any record or for any future event, you can also, of course, you can use that written material, or any you can also keep it as a written record for your future references as well. That is not possible in oral communication, and it also has the legal validity, of course, because why it is, I mean, why it has the legal validity, why it has the legal validity, it is just because in oral communication it is not possible, but in written communication it is of course possible. It is just because you can keep the record of of that material or of that message. And then organization of information, and it also has the informative of processor and wider reach. And why it has the organization of information, informative of processor, and also the wider reach, it is just because when something is is available in written, you of course it can be spread, or it can have wider reach, because I mean, the circulation is possible, or the dissemination of those ideas or messages is possible, which is not possible in oral communication. But because in oral communication there's a limit, because there's a limit of your voice and how many people you can address, right? So there's a limit. But in written communication, there's no limit. You can I mean, it always has the wider outreach. And for for running any organization, written communication is very, very, very important. And why it is uniformity of procedure. For example, in oral communication you cannot maintain the uniformity, right? But through the written communication you can maintain the uniformity, of course. And then it also promotes accountability for anything. For any kind of accountability, I mean, written communication is must. Without the written communication, there's no accountability. I mean, which is very much lacking, or which is very much absent in oral communication. So that is, I mean, that's why I mean, in oral communication there's no legal validity. And through the written communication you can also have I mean, it is also used for the authoritativeness also. So I mean, this is also one of the advantage or the benefit of written communication. But there are certain disadvantages as well of written communication. And what are these disadvantages as in comparison of oral communication? This written communication is uneconomical, because it also needs money. Because when you are writing something, you need paper, you need pen, you need you need email, you need to carry you should be very, very techno-friendly in order to use faxes, or writing emails, or typing WhatsApp messages, right? So here it's I mean, in both the process it requires. So this written process is entirely different from the oral communication. Oral communication requires nothing, and in written communication, that's why it is said that it is uneconomical. It may require money, it may require paper or pen, or other resources as well, which is which is generally oral communication doesn't require. And there's a clutter of access, paper. Sometimes when you are formulating your ideas and you are writing it down, and later on you find that this is something is incorrect, and you want to make the corrections in it, right? So you are writing it down for multiple times and then tearing it off. Then it means like that you are using multiple or excess of paper, and that is entirely useless. So it also it also becomes very sometimes difficult to afford, right? Because to afford it, I mean, written communication really requires money. Which is I mean, which is not the problem with oral communication. And of course, feedback and clarification is very slow, because when you are using the WhatsApp message or the emails or like letters or the orders or anything which is in written, of course, I mean, here in oral communication, the feedback and clarification is very prompt, very immediate, which is not possible, of course, in written communication, because it may take time, like 1 day, 2 day, hours, or like months, or sometimes years also, right? So like written communication is always, I mean, here the feedback is slow, and as well as the clarification is also slow. And it also requires literacy skills, which is not required in oral communication. Even the illiterate person can communicate, using the oral communication. But for like in written communication, one should be very, I mean, if a person can't read, or if a person can't write, then or like doesn't know that, if a person does not know that what are the the grammatical rules or the syntactical structure that that one should follow, then I mean, here the literacy skills are very important in terms of written communication. So the people who can't read and write, so they can't do generally, they can't have this written communication. And written communication is always very formal, right? When it is like all the things which are in written, then it is something which is very like very formal in nature, as in comparison of oral communication, which is entirely informal in nature. And of course, there is a risk of leaking out. For example, you must have heard about that there are so many competitive exams where you have that that exam is there's a, I mean, there's a the paper which got they actually, I mean, there's a risk of leaking out in written communication, which is not possible in oral communication, which is I mean, there's no risk of leaking out in oral communication. So these were some advantages and disadvantages. And here, here you can see that how we can make our writing, how we can write effectively. What are the certain? These are the certain these are the certain principles of clear and impactful written communication. So, for example, the key of effective communication is it should be very straightforward, to the point, and correctly grammatical, and always polite. And editing is not optional. Editing is not optional. So in written communication, one should be very direct and precise, and one should use a very common and daily and the words which we generally use in our day-to-day communication. Language should be very polite. It should not be overloaded, and there should be correct grammatical use. And of course, that because since the editing and rewriting is possible, so there is because editing is not optional, because once you have sent that message, then editing is not possible. So one should be very careful in order to make an effective writing. And so this is the complete, this is actually the integrated view of communication model, complete communication process. So there's a certain context, noise interface, and shared medium. So all influence of quality, all influence the quality of communication. All these things the media, I mean the idea which was generated, and the sender who was the the person where that message actually originated. And then encoding process that we have already discussed, encoding, message, medium, decoding, feedback received, and then the sender starts decoding, and then medium, feedback medium, and the feedback encoding, and then receiver encodes. These are certain takes away, key takes away from this lecture. So communication communication is a two-way cycle, where the sender and receiver, sender decoding, encoding, medium decoding, receiver, and feedback, these are certain elements. And encoding quality and decoding comprehension are both very, very critical to effective communication. And the third thing is that the noise and interference can discomfort, like distort message at any point in the communication chain. And verbal communication, for example, which is the blend of the two, the oral and written, is the most advanced and the structured form of human exchange. So this effective communication requires clarity, good vocabulary, active listening, and appropriate medium when you are when you are communicating the certain messages to your receiver. Thank you.